Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Arthur Brooks, President of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this wonderful event that I've been looking forward to so eagerly over the past few months. It's a Bradley lecture entitled James Madison, A Life Reconsidered, featuring AEI scholar Lynne Cheney. Well, she'll be talking about her brand new book, the biography of James Madison. It's sure to be a big bestseller, and you're here for the early words on this book. She'll be interviewed this evening by her husband, the 46th Vice President of the United States, and AEI trustee, Dick Cheney. This is a book that's already receiving great critical acclaim, most recently from the New York Times, which gave it a wonderful review, which is wonderful and weird. This book has also been critically hailed by none other than Michael Beschloss, one of America's best-known historians. With this compelling, elegant, original biography, Lynne Cheney brings the great, elusive James Madison back to life. Publishers Weekly, The Economist, you get the picture, and now you get to hear why this book is being critically acclaimed. I turn it over now to my colleague Lynne Cheney and to Dick Cheney.
We haven't rehearsed.
If this works, we're going to take this show on the road. Why James Madison? What turned you on to Madison?
Well, before I answer that, why are you interviewing me?
I'm interviewing you because in 1954, my father moved our family to Casper, Wyoming, where I met Lynn. We were both in the 8th grade. And I've often explained to people that Dad had a choice. He could have gone to Great Falls, Montana, or to Casper, Wyoming. He picked Wyoming, but that if he picked Montana, I would have never met Lynn. She would have married somebody else, and she said yes, and then he would have been Vice President of the United States.
Well, I thought you were going to talk about how I had fulfilled my wifely duty for a long time by interviewing you in various venues.
That's true.
And so now it's time to turn the tables. I wish you had let us rehearse. But go ahead. You want to know why James Madison?
Why James Madison? We've got a lot of founders. There are a lot of books that have been written, obviously, about the founders, including Madison. But I think you've produced a remarkable product here. And I am curious I think the crowd would be interested in what process you went through to make the decision that Madison was the founder you wanted to write about and how you went about it.
You know, it was really a long course. I served on the commission of the bicentennial of the Constitution in 1987. Seems like forever ago. And Warren Burger was really quite inspirational about how remarkable this man was and the Constitution was. And I began more and more to appreciate the magnitude of his accomplishments. At the same time, I was seeing that, he didn't have a great deal of appreciation from historians. If historians wrote about him, it was, after they finished with Washington and Jefferson and usually Adams. And when they did get to him, they talked about what a shy and sickly fellow he was, so that you couldn't imagine how he could have done the grand things that he did. The primary author of the Constitution, the primary author of the Bill of Rights, the first president to take the nation to war under the Constitution, and those are just the highlights. It was a career filled with accomplishment, and accomplishment of a kind that continues to affect our everyday civic life today. Really a remarkable man and a remarkable career.
What do you think was his biggest contribution?
It was the Constitution, surely. It was something that was entirely new under the sun, what they decided, the founders, the framers decided to undertake with the Constitution. It wasn't even believed to be possible to have a republic of vast extent. It was thought such an entity would fall apart without monarchical power at the center. So they were trying something that had never been tried, that the great thinkers of the time, like Montesquieu, said was impossible. Madison's gift, and you saw it in the Constitutional Convention as well as in many other places in his career, his great gift was to be able to break through conventional thinking, to be able to break through the idea that you couldn't have a republic of vast extent. to really think about it. It's really easy to accept conventional wisdom, but he didn't. He thought about it, broke through it, and saw that theoretically a republic of vast extent had a great advantage. There would be so many interests, so many factions, that no one of them would be able to dominate all the rest. And so a republic of vast extent could protect private rights in a way that a smaller one could not.
I was intrigued in the political business. Personal relationships count for a lot, but you talk a good deal about his relationships with others. But I say a word, for example, about his relationship with Washington. He obviously was very close, but eventually that was a somewhat strained relationship.
Well, in the beginning days of the Republic, Madison was Washington's most influential advisor. And the story I like to tell that makes that clear is that Madison wrote Washington's inaugural address. Washington had someone else write it first, and it was a disaster. So he asked Madison to stop by Mount Vernon and help him out. Madison did. Washington delivered the address. And then Madison, who was the leader of the House of Representatives, wrote the House's response to Washington's inaugural address that he had written. And then Washington asked Madison to write the president's response back to the House. So, it was this remarkable occasion when one man's voice was echoing off all the walls. I'm not sure there's ever been a time like that before, when, the chief advisor to the president has had such a hand in the beginning of an administration. And of course, this was in the beginning of the country. So he and Washington were trusted allies. After, and we'll talk about that later, I think, though, after Madison saw what Hamilton intended to do with the government, Hamilton did not hew to the idea that Madison knew was correct, that the Constitution created and the ratification conventions ratified a government of limited extent, a government of enumerated powers, a few enumerated powers, several actually, but it didn't set forth unlimited possibilities for the federal government. When Madison realized what Hamilton was up to, he became so troubled eventually that he put in place the mechanisms for an opposition political party. And that, it did many things. It created the most tumultuous decade in our history, I think, the 1790s. But it also meant a break with Washington. It was never public, there are no letters, but from the time that Madison became involved in setting up an opposition party, he never went to Mount Vernon again, and he'd been a frequent visitor. So, we think of the founders as, a great contented group, I guess. Everything is rosy, everyone is in agreement about what a wonderful thing we're doing. But that's just one example of how it wasn't all that different from today. Relationships were formed, relationships were broken, and everyone involved thought they were operating for the right reasons.
Well, there's one particular job that I was intrigued with, and that is how in the world they decided they needed a vice president.
Well, it was not, they didn't go straight there and say, wow, we need a vice president. They did, however, decide on an electoral college. And in the Electoral College, everyone would be able to cast 2 votes. Now, even that was the process of long deliberation and much back and forth conversation. But, okay, so everybody in the Electoral College gets 2 votes. The reason for 2 votes is that the small states believed that the big states would choose a big state president every time. So each elector had 2 votes, and he had to vote for someone besides someone from his own state with at least one of them. So that's the basic configuration. Then they started worrying that people would throw their second vote away. If you want John to be president, then you don't throw your second vote to Charlie, who's his chief rival. You throw it to Ray, who's not going anywhere. So how do you get people to make the second vote, to make that second vote a sincere one? Well, the answer is you create the vice presidency. And the fellow who comes in, and it was all fellows, of course, the fellow who comes in with the second most votes gets to be vice president. And that's how the office was created. It was the subject of much consternation from the very beginning. People thought it was, and it may be, that it interfered with the separation of powers, you know, because you've got this person who is a creature of the executive branch, but because he doesn't have anything to do, they made him president of the Senate. And there was a lot of argument about whether that was, and Elbridge Gerry and George Mason both cited that as among the reasons why they wouldn't sign the Constitution, because they saw this dangerous, and that was a word they both used, this dangerous officer had been created, and he would not only mix up the separation of powers, he was likely to create all sorts of mischief. You know, you really ought to tell. And Larry Silverman knows this. There was a case about gun control in which this became an issue. Why don't you tell that story? Because you'll remember the details.
Well, it's true it was Silberman's fault. You may remember there was a case that came before the D.C. Circuit on which Larry served, and that called into question the constitutional validity of the gun laws in the district, and whether or not that, in fact, violated the Second Amendment. And Larry wrote the opinion, which I thought was brilliant, that in fact it was in violation of the Second Amendment. And of course that went on up to the Supreme Court. And at that point, the question in the White House was, should we file a friend of the court brief with respect to that decision? And the decision was made, yes, we should. Justice Department was given the responsibility to craft the friend of the court brief. And when it came over to the White House from the Justice Department, it was the ultimate squish. I mean, it was totally a little of this, a little of that, and it did not give a ringing endorsement of the Silberman's decision. I didn't like it. I don't know whether the president liked it or not. He never said at that point. But I got a call shortly after we got the Justice Department brief from friends of mine in the Senate who wanted to know that in my capacity as president of the Senate, would I like to sign on with a brief that was a ringing endorsement of the Second Amendment and sort of ignored the Justice Department brief. And I thought that sounded good. Dave Addington, who's here today, he's back there in the row, was my counsel, and Dave was a bit of a hawk. And so we considered it and then said, absolutely, I'd love to sign on. So in effect, what I did was endorse and embrace and put my name on the Senate court brief rather than the administration's court brief from the Justice Department. That created consternation. There's fallout. The first thing that happened was the court, in effect, embraced the position that I had supported, following Larry Silberman's lead. And they questioned Justice Scalia about it at one point. And Nino, who among other things is a hunting buddy, said to the press, he said, well, we didn't know what to do, frankly. And then the vice president's brief arrived, and it was all there, abundantly clear what we should do.
He was being sarcastic, yes.
He was being sarcastic, but he often is. It created some problems in the West Wing because I was visited then by the White House Chief of Staff, good guy, friend, Josh Bolton. And Josh came in and he said, I want to call a process foul. And I said, what do you mean process foul? He said, well, I got to talk to Addington. I want to call a process foul. That we'd taken a position different than the administration's position. And it went right at the heart of the question of, are you the president of the Senate or are you vice president? You're the only officer, in effect, who has a foot and authority in both branches of the government. I told Josh he was free to go see Dave Addington, and he did. And the report I later got back was Dave informed him that he doesn't work for the President of the United States, he works for the Vice President of the United States.
I think you shared too much there at the
We
end.
got it all worked out.
Well, but it's a remarkable example of the relevance of this very old document to life today. I was listening last week to a dispute about whether the police can search your cell phone when they stop your car for a traffic violation. And this was being heard before the Supreme Court, and they will make a decision. But you think about that. It's an automobile, which of course Madison had no notion of. It's a cell phone, which he could not have imagined. But in the end, the justices will have to look at the Fourth Amendment, which Madison crafted, to see whether this amounts to unreasonable search and seizure. So the relevance of the document, even though we've made such progress in technological terms, is one of the miracles of it.
Can you say a word about the Federalist Papers and Madison's role and the role of the Federalist Papers in the ratification process?
It's part of his understanding of public relations. Now, Hamilton had thought of the Federalist. He had written the first Federalist and published it in a New York paper. But Madison saw, when Hamilton asked him, what a great thing this was, to explain the Constitution, to take up the objections that had been made to the Constitution in a public forum, so that people could begin to think about the controversies involved and to think about them in the way that Madison wanted them, and Hamilton and Jay a little bit wanted them to think about them. Moreover, and this was one of the interesting things to me, the Federalist Papers then went to Virginia. They were intended for the New York Ratification Convention, and I think they did their work there. But then they went to Virginia, where they weren't widely circulated, but they were circulated among the delegates to the Virginia Ratifying Convention. And again, it was Madison's voice echoing off every wall in Shockoe Hall, where the Virginia Ratification Convention occurred, partly because of the Federalist Papers. People had picked up their arguments from that, partly because of letters he had written. People wrote to him, asked him about subject A, B, or C, and he gave them the arguments to use. It was a remarkable feat of public relations before anyone had ever heard of that term. He understood, and I suppose you wanted to be high and theoretical about it, he understood that this was the government of the people, and the people had to be informed. He did the same thing when creating a political party. He set forth the rationale for a political party in a series of newspaper editorials, because it was thought to be such a nasty thing to do, to start a political party. He didn't think it was entirely pleasant, but he thought it was necessary, so he made the case.
Can you say a word about Dolley Madison? She played a prominent role.
But let me go back to the Federalist Papers for just a minute, because I was talking to a college audience, and so I sort of counted up what Madison had done. And he wrote at an even more frantic pace than Hamilton, although Hamilton wrote more Federalist Papers. There was one period, well over a month, when he was doing the equivalent of writing a 10-page paper every other day, which in and of itself doesn't sound so remarkable, but those papers became immortal, which is, if you think about it, that is really something. Dolley.
You didn't answer my question, so I'm going to change it.
But they want to hear about Dolley.
We'll get back there.
All right.
Just remember who's asking the question. But one of the things that always struck me, and especially, I think one of the things I was most impressed with in the book you wrote was Madison's health. And here's somebody. I'm here today because I had a heart transplant 2 years ago. You think back about Madison's career and all that he accomplished while he suffered from a grave, very grave, debilitating illness. And I think you do a better job of identifying what that was and talk a great deal about how that influenced the course of affairs. And obviously this was 200 years ago when medicine was nothing like what it is today.
At the end of his presidency, Madison wrote an autobiography in which he said, he wrote in the third person. The autobiography was in the third person. He said he suffered throughout his life at gradually extended intervals, from sudden attacks somewhat resembling epilepsy and suspending the intellectual functions. Now, I wasn't the first person to see this paper. It hasn't been published. You have to go to some trouble and go to Princeton to see it if you want to quote from it. But no one else, well, other scholars have just sort of not wanted to deal with it. What do you say when a man has said this? And some of them derided it. His principal biographer said he suffered from epileptoid hysteria, which doesn't do your reputation any good. And so I decided that Madison was not a man who spoke lightly, that I would take him at his word and I would see what it could mean. And I consulted with a friend up in New York, a friend that a friend introduced me to, a doctor of a neurologist who heads an epilepsy department at New York University Hospital. And with Dr. Davinsky's help and reading a lot of 18th century health manuals, it's pretty likely he suffered from complex partial seizures, which is a mild form of epilepsy. You don't fall down on the ground and convulse, but you do have your intellectual functions suspended for a while. This happened to Madison pretty clearly at Princeton. He became very despondent as a result of this first of his seizures as an adult, partly because if you had epilepsy or anything resembling it in the 18th century, you were thought to be evil, full of sin, possessed by the devil even. And this was a pretty heavy burden for a young man to carry. He finally shrugged it off with, I think, historic consequences. He decided that he didn't have to believe what everyone told him to believe, and that no one should have to believe what everyone told him to believe. There's this break in his letters. It's so clear. One day he's, talking about how he's worried he's going to die and about the importance of living a religious life so you can go to heaven. And the next day, all of that talk is gone, and Madison becomes an advocate, the foremost advocate of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience in the early republic. So it wasn't just important for his personal story, though it is amazing. You can trace where these sudden attacks occurred. It wasn't just important for his personal story. I think that it had consequences for the nation, because his affirmation of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience was as great and maybe greater than Jefferson's. And that, of course, echoes down for all of us today.
Dolley.
Oh, Dolley. Well, she was beautiful. Men used to stop in the street in Philadelphia when she walked by. They were so dumbstruck by her beauty. She was a shapely woman, not what we would call model thin in the Vogue fashion, but very attractive. She wore very low-cut dresses in the French fashion, and she was very confident of herself. She had black hair and white skin and ruby red lips. It was the whole package. Madison saw her and immediately asked a college friend to introduce them. And it sort of tells you what a small world the 18th century was when I tell you that the college friend was Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr knew Dolley's family, and so he arranged the meeting. Dolley received him in her parlor wearing a crimson dress and yellow beads, and he was a goner. They married a few months later. He was older than she by a considerable amount, but theirs was a love story. Fortunately, Dolley had an abscess on her knee at one point in their marriage, and she had to go to Philadelphia to see the best doctor in the world. And while she was there, he couldn't stay the whole time. We have letters. Now, for the most part, we don't have letters because they were together all the time. But during this one period, they wrote back and forth, and they used the words that Abigail and John did, calling one another dearest friend. beloved, the woman I love more than anything else, the man whom I respect more than anyone else in the world. It's, you know, you really do get a sense of what a warm and loving relationship it was. Dolley was, however, also a political asset. I'm not sure that the gifts she had would be deployed to such a good result today, but her gift was hospitality. And she knew how to bring people in and make them feel good about one another. She didn't mind having political conversations when she had a crowd over. Jefferson wouldn't invite both Federalists and Republicans to the same party. He didn't like disagreeable disputation or disputation of any sort at his dinner table. But Dolley threw open the doors of her F Street home and brought everybody together. This was a good thing to do in the early days of Washington because it was a miserable place. It was new. There were only a few houses. The Madisons were lucky to have one. The congressmen and senators, for the most part, lived in boarding houses. And one of them said something like, we've become as insensate as bears, meaning maybe they felt like they were hibernating. But he said, we're stunned by talking about nothing but politics from morning till night. And there was no place to go, no clubs. There was one club that featured rope dancers. Now, I've wondered what that was. I think maybe tightrope walkers, do you think? Well, that's what I'd like to think. So there was nothing to do. So when they went to the Madisons, members of Congress and the Senate, they left feeling very good about Secretary of State Madison. This was very valuable in 1808 when the nominees for the president were chosen by the Congressional Caucus. Dolley, there's contemporary testimony to how much her warmth and her entertaining, how much she gave Madison an advantage over his chief rival, George Clinton of New York. So Dolley was not only beautiful, she too had a great sense of PR. You know, you see that in this 3-day letter she wrote about the burning of the White House. A 3-day letter? You know, it's pretty clear she wrote it after the fact, but she understood that it would be much more dramatic if you made it seem as though it were being written at the time. But she knew how to create a historical record for herself as well as how to get the presidency for James Madison.
You mentioned in your remarks that one of his accomplishments was he was the first president to fight a war under the Constitution. Was he a good wartime president? How did he perform?
He was as steady a commander-in-chief as I think we have ever had. It was a war that was not popular in New England. It was pretty clear that there was an effort to starve the war by persuading New England bankers not to loan the government money for it. There were other acts that you could only regard as seditious. Madison didn't try to repress this. He'd been through the sedition acts himself by this time, and he didn't try to repress the outcries against the war. He did, however, send people secretly to New England to sort of keep an eye on things, and he would be ready to send in troops should there be an effort to secede, which was talked about with great seriousness. But part of the reason his contemporaries respected him was that he hadn't gone after the dissenters. They respected him as well because in the United States it was widely believed that we had succeeded in this war. We had succeeded in the sense of showing that we had a naval force to be reckoned with, some great naval victories. The story of the Navy in the War of 1812 was quite a wonderful one. It was evident at the end of the war that we knew also how to build an army. Now, it took us a long time to get there and had some pretty embarrassing defeats before. But, you know, John Adams was a cranky guy. He didn't like praising other people. But after the War of 1812, John Adams said, Madison's administration has covered itself with more glory than any of its predecessors. That meant Washington, Jefferson, and Adams himself. Not the kind of compliment that Adams handed out. You know, today there's a sort of feeling that the War of 1812 was a bit of a bumble, but his contemporaries sure didn't think so.
Talk about his biggest disappointment.
Well, his biggest disappointment in himself, I think, was slavery and his inability to free himself from being dependent on slave labor. He said early in his life that that was his goal. He thought slavery was morally wrong. He had no sympathy for the people who wanted to encourage enlistment in the Revolution by giving each enlistee a slave. Madison said, we're fighting a war for liberty. How can we get people to fight for liberty by giving them a slave? But in the end, he couldn't solve the problem. Neither he nor Jefferson, who also spoke eloquently against slavery, managed to free themselves from it or to find a way to end slavery. Madison became caught up in the colonization movement. The idea being there was no place for freed slaves to go. This is one of the things that made it difficult. By the time Madison was retiring, Virginia, it was illegal in Virginia to free a slave without removing him from the state. It was illegal in many of the surrounding states for a freed slave to move there. So they came up with this plan to colonize slaves to Africa. It wasn't workable. Anyone who looked at it, and Madison was not a stupid man. He must have known it wasn't workable. For one thing, slaves didn't want to go to Liberia. The slaves at Montpelier had been there longer, their families had been there longer than Madison. So that it wasn't a real solution, but it was the only thing he could figure out, and he clung to it almost desperately and died owning slaves.
Can you say a word about how he spent his time after he left office?
He did what ex-politicians do. He gathered together his papers. He didn't write a book, but he got his notes in order. He even altered some of his notes, which infuriated people like Dumas Malone, Jefferson's biographer. At one point, Madison came across a letter he'd written about Lafayette long ago, and in the letter he'd suggested that Lafayette was full of himself. And there's a great deal of evidence to support the fact that Lafayette was indeed quite a self-satisfied young man. But, by this time, Lafayette had been thrown into prison after the French Revolution turned. His life had not gone well. And I think Madison just decided that Lafayette deserved better. But in order to change it, it was written in code. It was written in cipher. Jefferson had deciphered the letter, and you could see Jefferson's handwriting above the cipher. Madison had to imitate Jefferson's handwriting. And when Dumas Malone figured this out, he was appalled. I think it's just very human, at the end of a long life, to have more sympathy than maybe you did at the beginning. Did I answer your question?
Close enough. I understand the plan is for us to have an opportunity to open things up for questions from the audience directed at the author. Is there anything else I should have asked that I didn't, Lynne?
No, you did a really nice job. I want to say that we've been married almost 50 years.
Come on.
And we're risking a lot with this format, is my point. I see a hand right there, a tie. There we go. Mm-hmm.
First off, thank you for Kings of the Hill. I told a lot of stories from that book when I gave tours of the Capitol as a staff assistant there. And my professor, Dr. Whitehurst, who served with you, Mr. Cheney, in Congress, named one of his classes after that book. So thank you for that book very much. It's a great book. And my question is, Richard Brookhiser, in his book about Madison, at a similar lecture to this, I asked him about what you had mentioned about James Madison writing Washington's inaugural, then writing the response to it, et cetera, et cetera. His response was that Madison, along with a lot of others, had an emotional attachment to him and couldn't bring themselves to believe that he just disagreed with them. They had to think his mind was poisoned by people like Hamilton. Did you come across any of this in your research? Is there actual evidence of this, or is that just conjecture?
You find that more than once in the early republic, the idea that someone is manipulating the president. The president's really a good guy. but there's this evil genius that is that. That's manipulating, and but it's such a good political tactic if you think about it, because you demean the person who's the evil genius and you make the president look weak. So it wasn't something dreamed up in modern times. It's been going on for quite a while. Yes.
Thank you very much. I was curious about Madison's relationship with Hamilton. So apparently Madison did not appreciate Hamilton. Could you explain that a little more?
Well, they were colleagues, friendly colleagues, if not friends, during the writing the Federalist Papers, during the attempts during the Revolution to get the Congress to come up with some money to fight the war. They were friendly colleagues. There's this one wonderful scene, and this actually occurs after the first Congress is underway. It's during the first summer, where a neighborhood woman says that she saw Madison and Hamilton. They were working in Hamilton's garden, the house on Wall Street, and they would be in serious conversation, and then they would turn and play with the monkey in the neighbor's yard. Now, this is a wonderful picture. Imagine somebody on Wall Street has a monkey running loose, and Madison and Hamilton find this amusing. But it wasn't long after that Hamilton made clear that he believed the Constitution permitted the Congress to pass any measure that was within the realm of the general welfare, the phrase in Article 1, Section 8. Madison was sure and had historical evidence to show that that was not what the convention had meant, nor was it what the ratification conventions had meant. They had established a government of limited means, limited reach. But when Hamilton went in that direction, Madison took the lead in establishing an opposition party. And Hamilton, this idea in the early years that the government had been won and created at such cost. You know, that we'd had a war, we had the difficulty with the Articles of Confederation, we had the Constitutional Convention. So much blood and toil had been expended to create the government that anybody who opposed it was a traitor. And Hamilton fell into that way of thinking right away. You know, they're simply being disloyal to the country, and they're certainly being bad friends to me. He wrote a 6-page letter, I think it was, to a friend of Madison's. He didn't go directly to Madison, but he knew Madison would hear of this. And so, you know, that was the split with Hamilton and was the split with Washington. The decade of the 1790s was quite a time as a result of there being an opposition now, as there had not been in the beginning. Yes?
I'm really fascinated, looking forward to reading the book. Any consideration of moving into other patriots, George Mason? Because I know he's one that really hasn't been examined thoroughly, and I know some of his principles and views aligned a lot with Madison. But and I say this because my son, who goes to Mason, knows very little about him, which makes me upset. But I was wondering if that was something you may want to.
It's a great idea. I'm not sure for me, but you know, Mason was just a fascinating guy, and you had to admire him for his dedication to his family. He had numerous children, 9 or 10, and his wife had died. Of course, he had slaves. You know, he had plenty of household help, but he refused time and again to undertake public responsibilities, not because he had no interest in public affairs in a time when they were absolutely compelling, but because, you know, he was worried about his children. Madison knew how popular he was. Madison, you know, consulted with him early on. He was a very important figure and a person that I personally admire. So I hope the book is written. Right now, I get at book signings, I get James Madison University students. You know, in their purple and gold, I think the colors are. So if I did Mason, that'd be a whole new congregation to appeal to. Yes, in the back.
Okay. Hi. In your book, obviously, you deal with one of the first power couples, and so that's a historical thing. And you and the Vice President sitting there today represent a new type of a power couple, DC power couple. So, what's the similarities and what's differences? This is to both of you. Do you think you find being Dolley and James, and now the two of you?
Well, maybe one thing that's the same is I don't think I ever gave you political advice. I gave you a lot of personal advice. But, I don't think I ever offered an opinion about Iraq. Did I?
No, the way our relationship worked from early on, we came to Washington. I was going to do my dissertation and go back to Wisconsin and finish my PhD and teach. And Lynne came and was working on her doctorate in English Lit, and she finished hers and I didn't. But she got sidetracked to some extent because we'd made the choice to stay in Washington. But I can remember, especially in those early years, going home in the evening, and she wanted to know everything I could tell her about.
That's true.
About what had happened that day in the White House or whatever else I was working on. So there was always I think a shared common interest, if you will, in public affairs. And there were times when I sought her advice on certain subjects that I probably won't talk about.
Oh, but it's true, that generosity, coming home and at the end of a long day when you're really tired and talking about what was going on. But it was a way for me, to stay sort of plugged in with your life. I think that was a really generous thing to do and a hard thing to do. But politics can be pretty isolating for the spouse, and I think you did a really nice job. Thank you for bringing me in.
And none of it would have happened unless Lynne had been very tolerant over the years. The only time I can remember certain hesitation was when George Bush asked me to run for vice president. I came home from work that day, and we were in Dallas, and Lynne was there, and our daughters, and I said to Lynne, honey, sell the house, I quit my job, we're going back into politics. She was not enthusiastic. Nor was daughter Mary. Daughter Liz was out in the garage painting yard signs. She was ready. We worked it all out, and away we went. But it was usually a family enterprise, and literally, it's we've spent so much of our time in the business, so to speak. We can't think back on our lives without being heavily influenced by the years we spent together here in various and sundry pursuits, most of them having to do with public policy.
In any case, my point was, I think that spouses, and it's not just wives, it's husbands as well, spouses can be a very supportive and important part. They need to be included in a political life. But I'm not sure that it's very successful when, the spouse who's not the one in power, has very strong ideas about what should be done. I'm just glad I didn't have very strong ideas about that. Though many other things. Yes.
Thanks for joining us today, folks. Arthur, you are 4 for 4 if you're still up front, so thank you again. Dr. Cheney, could you look at the importance of the Fed 50s, maybe 51 especially, as a lens on the Constitution? And if you could make an addition, I guess 18 years since Kings of the Hill, who would you add to your list? And as a third and last, assuming we can't directly put our questions to the moderator, if James Madison were, say, from the desert Southwest and he liked to fly fish, who do you suppose he would like to take along with him, Edward Snowden or Vladimir Putin? Thanks.
Well, that's too hard. And it distracted me from the rest of your question. Federalist 51, of course, is crucial, and the idea that government had to have checks and balances in it, and that ambition needed to be set against ambition. Madison, I think, took that into the political realm as well. It wasn't just theoretic. And so for him, I can't, it's hard to explain how much political parties and the idea of political parties, how the idea was hated in his time. But, you know, when he saw Hamilton's ambition moving the country in one direction, I think he understood that that idea of counterbalance, of achieving a balance through equal weightings and putting one on the scale and then another to make them equal. I think he saw that play out in the larger political realm as well. So I think 51 is more important even than those who think of it as primarily a theoretical document do. Yes?
Generations from now, our great-grandchildren, will they have the benefit of your letters to each other to understand our times?
I say generations from now, will our grandchildren, great-grandchildren have the benefit of your letters to each other to understand our times and your relationship to each other? It's obvious there's a great admiration between you.
Dick and I did write to one another a lot when we were in college because we were separated. I was doing a very good job at my college and he wasn't doing such a good job at his. But we burned those. And you know, honestly, now do people write letters? You have to be separated from your spouse and then you do an email, and I suppose maybe there's, you know, a place somewhere there's an email or two, but not very much, I'll tell you. Yes.
From Madison's perspective, during the convention, during the Constitutional Convention, what do you think he would say was the most important issues that he was involved in during the convention?
During the convention? Gosh, that's a hard one because he was involved in everything. One of the most serendipitous things I think about this, they were having trouble figuring out how to elect a president. And they had come up with all sorts of possibilities. And finally, this whole issue was given to the Committee on Postponed Parts. I love that committee name. And, you know, sitting behind closed doors, they decided the first proposal had been to let the Congress decide on the presidents to vote for the president. And there have been lots of others. Let the people decide, let an electoral college decide. But behind these doors, they had come up with, up against a wall and said, let's just go back to the first proposal and we'll let the legislature, the Congress, decide who the president should be. And they were about to get up and to walk back out into the East Room where the delegates were meeting when a delegate from Delaware who had been ill, John Dickinson, came into the meeting, and he had not attended any of the others. They explained to him what they were doing, and he said, well, that's not going to work. The people have to be more invested in this process than they would be if the Congress were making this selection. And so at that point, Madison sat down, reviewed all of the proposals, and came up with the scheme we still operate according to today, the Electoral College. But what I've often thought is, if Dickinson hadn't walked through that door, we'd have Congress choosing the president. And can you imagine what a different bunch of presidents we would have had? You would never have had an outsider like Ronald Reagan. As it is, only one Speaker of the House has ever been elected president, and that's James Polk. Speakers of the House would have been a lot more likely to move into the presidency. So as a study in alternative history, it would be really interesting to try to think what it would be like if Congress were in charge of picking the president. Yes?
Thank you both for coming. Could you talk a little bit about James Madison's personal religious views?
Wow, that's an interesting question. You know, he was of Orthodox Church of England religious views until his sudden attack, until his epilepsy came along, and church orthodoxy said to him, you're evil, you're sinful, you're possessed by the devil. And this is an interesting belief. You all remember Tony Coelho. Tony was a very important actor in the House of Representatives when Dick and I first came to Washington. Tony had epilepsy and had been in the priesthood and was not allowed to continue after his epilepsy became apparent. So there was still this hangover, that epilepsy is somehow incompatible with being a religious, steady, good person. As a result of that, I don't think Madison held orthodox religious views. He might have been a little Unitarian, perhaps. That's what one person who visited with him thought. At the end of his life, he wrote a fascinating letter to a fellow named Frederick Beasley, who'd written to ask him to read something Beasley had written about how to prove the existence of God. It was one of these arguments, the kind that philosophers make, very difficult to follow and very detailed. And Madison wrote back and he said, I agree with you that nothing is more important to society than religion. It's important for the society as a whole. But I think if you want people to believe in God, you need to ask them to look around at the natural world. And it seemed as close as he ever came to saying, when I wake up in the morning at Montpelier and I look across and I see the Blue Ridge Mountains and I see the dogwood in bloom, then I think to myself, how can there not be a God? And he, in the end, cast it as a matter of belief. He did not believe, as many deists did, that you could decide through reason that there was a God. So it was a very complicated matter. That's a good question. And Carlin, is that the question we should end on? I surprised you, sorry.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for a delightful and deeply substantive introduction to this wonderful book. I think it's clear to all of us why Gordon Wood, the distinguished historian, wrote about this on the front page of the New York Times in his book review, that this is probably the best single volume history of James Madison's life. And now for what's next. I know many of you have purchased books, and Lynne has agreed to sign them. They're ready to be purchased books outside. And what we'd like you to do is to form a line in the center aisle, and then Lynne will sign all of the books. We'll also be having a reception outside, so you can go back and forth from the line to the reception. And finally, I'd like to say on behalf of all of my colleagues at AEI, how very grateful we are for your long association with AEI. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlin.